Thanks to at home for joining us this hour. I just flew in from Miami. Whew, boy, are my arms tired. You knew it was coming. Actually, the reason my arms are actually tired is because I landed in time to watch the end of the U.S. women's soccer team match where they beat France in that amazing game. And there was a lot of hands in the air, cheering and fist pumping. It was very exciting. USA, USA, USA. Honestly, it's just been a super exciting few days. I can barely tell whether I am coming or going. I am both so excited still and so fried. This might be one of those shows where things go wrong. Just letting you know right now. I will say also, just this week, one of the disorienting things about all the excitement this week is that I do sort of feel like I've just had a little spacewalk out of the news for a few days because of this two-night Democratic debate eclipsing everything else. I mean, it's like the country barely noticed, but the president's campaign chairman really did just get perp-walked through a courthouse to face his next set of felony charges, which is just a remarkable thing to have happen on the day that Democratic candidates are starting their primary to pick someone to run against President Trump. I mean, there's President Trump's campaign chairman in handcuffs, while his deputy campaign chairman also awaits sentencing, and his national security advisor also awaits sentencing, and his personal lawyer is in federal prison for crimes prosecutors say the president directed him to commit. I mean, it's not being made into a big issue in the campaign, honestly. For better or for worse, it's really not. But what that means is that, you know, for us citizens, here and now, in our time on Earth, as Americans, we really do just have images like this of the president's campaign chairman in handcuffs, right? And that's just sort of waltzing along the margins of the news with nobody really taking much notice, and the president planning to run for re-election. We also got the conservative-dominated Supreme Court catching the Trump administration in the act of trying to jerry-rig the census so it undercounts Latinos and thereby undercuts Latino voting power. They tried it. They lied to the courts about why they were doing it and how, and the court stopped them, an incredibly interesting and dramatic ruling from the Supreme Court yesterday. At the same time, almost literally at exactly the same time, we also got the court giving thumbs up to the states totally rigging congressional districts to benefit whichever party is in control in that state. And I know the whole gerrymandering thing sometimes just sounds like another fine print process thing, but that gerrymandering ruling from the Supreme Court yesterday, it utterly scrambles the playing field for electoral politics for the next decade. And it urgently changes what both parties are going to need to prioritize right now for the next year, for the next election. Because whatever happens in the presidential election in 2020, whatever happens in the House and the Senate elections in 2020, all of a sudden, thanks to that Supreme Court ruling yesterday, we now know that the thing you're someday going to look back on and care the most about in terms of what happened politically in 2020 is not necessarily the presidential race or the Senate race or the House race. It's the elections for your state legislature, of all things. Because whichever party controls state legislatures next year, that party will, they've just been given basically unfettered power to draw districts in that state in ways that more or less permanently disenfranchise the other party. In most cases, for a whole decade at a time until there's another census in 2030. I mean, just as an example, Democratic states and Republican states have drawn partisan gerrymandered maps. One of the maps that ended up before the Supreme Court for this ruling that we got yesterday was a map from North Carolina. North Carolina Republicans ended up in court in the Supreme Court case because they devised a plan for their state where if North Carolina voted basically straight down the middle, where half the votes in the state were cast for Democratic legislators and half were cast for Republican legislators. If it was an even split in the state vote, that would result in 10 North Carolina congressional seats going to Republicans and only 3 going to Democrats. Even vote, 10-3 outcome. That's how much they rigged the game in North Carolina. An equal vote from equal numbers of voters in both parties. Republicans get 10 seats, Democrats get 3. That is the case the Supreme Court was looking at from North Carolina when they said this week, they said yesterday, that's absolutely fine. We have no role in telling you not to do that. And so I know that Democrats and Republicans have done this. They were also looking at a Democratic gerrymandered map in Maryland. But the two parties, broadly speaking, have come to different positions on this as an ideological issue. Republicans are very, very happy with gerrymandering, and Democrats are getting to be uncomfortable with it. Now, thanks to the Supreme Court ruling, Republicans will be free to do that extreme form of gerrymandering, or worse, wherever they are in control, wherever they hold the state legislatures. And now the only way Democrats can compete against that is if they agree to do the same thing themselves in the states that they control. I mean, when I say that the two parties have come to a different place on this, if you look at Democrats' policy proposals on this right now, and there's a lot of Democratic activism on it right now, what you'll see is Democrats proposing big, good government disarmament on this issue. Democrats have been saying, let's have our districts chosen by nonpartisan commissions. Let's take the parties and the self-interest and the partisanship out of it. That's how Democrats have been approaching this recently. With this Supreme Court ruling, that is now over, or at least that would be unilateral disarmament on the part of Democrats that would ensure permanent control of Congress by the Republican Party for at least a decade and beyond that for the foreseeable future. So, I mean, Democrats had been trying, including a lot of Democrats on the debate stage, right? Democrats have been trying to sort of dial this back and say this shouldn't be a partisan thing. The Supreme Court has now said this is going to be a partisan thing. Democrats, it's your choice whether or not you play, but Republicans, free reign, and the Republicans are perfectly happy to go with it. So what does this mean? I mean, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat watching me right now, if you know someone who ought to run for something, or if you ought to run for something, the thing you or your friend ought to run for is the state legislature or the state senate in your state. And you better do it right now because whoever is elected in this next election specifically, whoever is elected in state legislatures in 2020, whichever party gains control of state legislatures in 2020 is going to get to set district maps for a decade, which will decide control of the U.S. House for a decade. And will control of your state for a decade. If you were ever going to run for something or support a campaign for someone running for state legislature or state senate, now is the time. That Supreme Court ruling is absolutely huge.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.